Hey pals, I'm here today in my bedroom because there is much better light in this room at the moment to do my December reading wrap up. I read about, I think 15 books in December, I'm not quite sure, so this could be a bit long, but I can't be able to split it into 2 videos, so I'm going to try and be, as brief as possible. These first couple are pretty well known on BookTube, so I don't feel like I need to spend too long talking about them. And the first one is British on Race, Identity and Belonging by Afua Hirsch. I should have said I'm going to talk about these books in the order I read them because, again, it's just easier. So I've had this one since it came out. Everybody kept telling me I would adore it, and lots of people kept telling me to audiobook it, and I kept being like, no, I'm going to read it physically, even though the physical copy is not particularly comfortable to hold. Anyway, I caved, and I ended up audiobooking this, which was definitely the way to go because I really enjoyed listening to the author narrate it. So there was big parts of this where I thought this was going to be a 5-star read for me, and the whole time it had been sitting on my shelves unread, I did think it would be a 5-star read. In the end, I'd say this was like a 4-star read. I'd definitely recommend it, but I felt like the first half was stronger than the second. So Afua Hirsch is a journalist in the UK, and this is a blend of non-fiction and memoir. So she's talking about the intersection of race, identity and belonging as a black person in Britain, and in a lot of ways she uses examples of other people's lives to do that, but she also tells you the narrative of her life. So I like the way this book is sectioned. You get chapters on things like origins, heritage, bodies, and there was 2 sections I really enjoyed in particular. There was one section where she really talks about the Williams sisters, and she focuses a lot on how they were like awfully treated in tennis, and she talks about the facts. So there's lots of discussion about class as it links to race in the UK in this, because the author grew up to a wealthy family in Wimbledon. Her mother is black and her father is white, and she was very used to being in surroundings where she was the only black person in the room, but she's very aware of her privilege because she marries a man who is from a sort of poor working class background in London, and she says he had much more like privilege of heritage because he was very aware of where he came from, but he had less privilege in every other way compared to her. So she does acknowledge her privilege. There was a couple of moments where I felt she didn't perhaps acknowledge it quite as much as she should. For example, she goes to, I think, Oxford, and she describes the college she was at within Oxford as small and unpretentious. Any university that charges you extra to be part of like an elite college society is not unpretentious. So I don't know, I just felt like that perhaps shouldn't have been there. But I really enjoyed the commentary. So I love the chapter about the Williams sisters and what they represent and the way they're treated in a super white dominated sport such as tennis. And I also loved the chapter where she focused on adoption, and she talks about the history of adoption as pertains to getting children who are not white, basically, adopted or fostered in the UK. So she speaks about the fact that there was a period in history where they said that black children should only be adopted or fostered by black parents, and then there was commentary that wasn't right and they should be fostered or adopted by white people, and she uses lots of statistics to back up her thoughts, but also she speaks to people who lived through that time as black children who went through the adoption system. So I loved those sections. However, I felt that her writing wasn't quite as strong when she was talking more about herself personally, and particularly as pertains to her trying to find out more about her heritage and moving to different parts of Africa to try and find that. I felt that her writing just didn't excel there. I think she's much better at writing just sort of non-fiction about the general experience and not as much specifically to her own. So I really enjoyed this. I ended up giving it 4 stars. The next book I have the advanced reader's copy of and not the finished copy, so I'm going to just put the nice cover up here, and that is It's Not About the Burqa, a Muslim woman on faith, feminism, sexuality and race. This is edited by Mariam, and this had around 15 essays in it, I think. So I read this one and I definitely enjoyed it. As is always the case with an essay collection with different authors, you're going to prefer certain people's voices. I found this informative and enjoyable. Definitely enjoyed some people's voices more than others. I always love anything that focuses on a mother-daughter relationship, so I really liked there was a few that commented on that, and changes in how strict their faith was and how that changed through the ages. I thought that was really interesting. I think what stopped me from really loving this collection, I think I'd give this about 3.5 stars, is that I found that a lot of the voices were quite similar in terms of they were sort of, a lot of them were quite middle ground. There was one essay that was a bit more left-leaning and perhaps a couple that were a bit more right, but a lot of them feel like they would encompass the same space in Muslim communities. And I think for an essay collection to say that it's sort of talking about Muslim women on faith, feminism, sexuality and race, I think there needed to be a broader scope of Muslim women. So whilst I enjoyed this, I felt like I got the same out of a lot of the essays, and so what I've done is I've sort of noted down the voices who I liked hearing from the most, and I'm going to try and seek out books they've written specifically just from their perspective, to try and get, you know, a broader range of knowledge. And the next one I want to talk about is Grass by Gendry-Kim. This is a non-fiction narrative about the life of Lee Oxon. So the author speaks to Lee Oxon, who is a lady, I think in her 80s or 90s now, and she is a Korean woman who was forced into sexual slavery by the Japanese military during the Second World War, I believe, and she now lives in the House of Sharing, which is a sort of care home and living museum for what was termed as comfort women by the Japanese military, essentially women who were abducted and forced into sexual slavery, and served the Japanese military in this capacity. And even though she's so elderly, she still works as an activist to try and get the Japanese government to acknowledge what happened, to offer a formal apology, because horrifically, if going through, you know, kidnap and sexual slavery wasn't enough, a lot of these women who did survive were disowned by their family because their communities viewed them as, well, like, they didn't view it as rape. They viewed it as these women had participated and served Japanese soldiers, and so they were sort of, you know, twice punished, and a lot of them were unable to bear children afterwards because of the horrific things that were done to them. So this is a really hard read, you know, filled with trigger warnings, but it's very artfully done. It doesn't feel gratuitous at any point. You feel like you're told what's necessary to be told to understand this history. I think telling the story in this way, where you have obviously a lot of it is historical and you go back through Lee Oxon's life, and that's the illustrations you see. You also see moments where the author is sitting in Lee Oxon's room in the care home talking to her in the present day when this was being, this story was being drawn together. And you also hear from the author herself saying, you know, this is going to be really difficult to do. You know, I didn't manage to go see Lee Oxon for this amount of time. So I guess it has a feeling of Mouse by Art Spiegelman, in that you have the historical narrative, but you also have the commentary of the person pulling that historical narrative together. So this is obviously devastating. I think a really important read, and I think it was handled really artfully. So I would, you know, I'd recommend this to people who think they would be able to read it. Then I was sent this tiny little book, I Hate Men by Pauline Harmange. This is translated from the French by Natasha Alera. This is only about 80 pages long. It is a single essay and it's very, very short. My hands are really shaky, so sorry the books are wobbling. And yeah, conflicted feelings about this one. So in some ways I thought she had some interesting points about feminism. So what the author is arguing is that because misogyny exists, we should respond with misandry, I can't say it, which is the, you know, the hating of men, right? But she's saying those two things can never be equal, because misogyny has you know, a whole system of oppression behind it. So us responding with misandry isn't equivalent to how awful misogyny is. I mean, she's saying that because misogyny exists, because the patriarchy exists, the best thing we can do is respond with hating men until they earn our trust. So we should distrust all men because of the system of oppression they have behind them, the way they gain privilege from oppressing women, and they should have to earn that trust. So, you know, the title's very clickbaity and I don't really agree with it. I also saw somebody's review, which I found really interesting, where they said if you follow this line of argument, what you're saying is that down to the sort of, I guess, smallest denominator, you're saying that every minority or oppressed group should hate the oppressor, then you would end up with most of the world hating somebody else, because, you know, the only people who would be left not hating anybody would be people who fall under, like, loads of forms of oppression to the point where like they don't oppress anyone else. So like Pauline Harmange herself as a white woman would be hated by black women, and so on and so forth. So I agree with that. You know, like the title is super clickbaity. But there are a couple of points she makes which I agreed with and I thought were interesting, certainly. But I also, you know, another thing I always struggle with things like this is the fact that it's so binary. When you have a discussion like this, you're discussing gender in such a binary fashion, and she does acknowledge non-binary people in like one sentence. I don't think enough. So yeah, this was interesting, but I think it's, you know, it's short, and it has some issues. Then I listened to an audiobook that was House of Correction by Nicci French. It just felt like an easy listen. This is a standalone crime drama, I guess, fairly slow. I have read the first book in the Frida Klein series by Nicci French, and I didn't enjoy it all that much. I know Jen and lots of other people really love that series, and I found there was a few things about it that annoyed me, and I feel the same about this one, unfortunately. The premise of this is that a woman is arrested for murdering her neighbour because his body is found in her shed and she is covered in his blood and she cannot remember what happened in the hours leading up to his death. So people think she's had like a psychotic episode and killed him. And she decides that she is going to defend herself. She's not going to have a lawyer, and she is going to investigate the case by asking people from the village to come into the prison to meet her, and she is going to defend herself in court. So my issues with this are, I think the first 2/3 are a bit too long. She bangs on and on and on about the fact that she doesn't think she did it, why she doesn't think she did it, and how she's investigating, and she goes over the same things again and again. I just think that could have been shortened a bit. Like, I felt like I got the point like 10 times over. And I don't often say that I think books are too long, but I thought this was. I also felt like we're told very often how intelligent our protagonist is. How, like, you know, she could have done so much of her life. She's incredibly intelligent. And yet, before she gets into the courtroom, she doesn't really look into like any rules of the courtroom, the way you're supposed to speak to people, the way you have to like submit forms in advance, the way you have to do things in a certain order. And I just don't find that believable. You decide to argue your own case, you have a decent amount of time to do it, you're very intelligent, you know that you know, all of us have seen crime dramas on the television, and you wouldn't think, I best look into the way this is all done, like you would. So I found that quite annoying. And there is this, you know, section towards the end where it gets like very courtroom drama, and I just found a lot of that fairly unbelievable. And then I didn't like the resolution. I'm not going to spoil anything, but the resolution comes in like the last 3 pages, and I was just left feeling like the rug was pulled out from under us and we had no chance of trying to solve this mystery, and it was just a bit annoying. So yeah, didn't enjoy this one, gave it 2 stars. Then we have a poetry collection. This is an anthology. This is Islands Are But Mountains, new poetry from the United Kingdom. I picked this up because after reading The Black Flamingo by Dean Atta, I want to try some of Dean's poetry, and I found out that Dean doesn't have a collection published, but he is published in this collection, and so I decided to pick it up. I enjoyed this. I thought that quite a lot of the poems were pretty strong. I found some new poets who I enjoyed their work, particularly an author called Charlotte Baldwin. Some of these poets come up in here more than once, and I think Charlotte had 2 or 3 poems in here. I really enjoyed all of them, but Charlotte doesn't have any published collections yet either, so I will be following to see when Charlotte does bring a collection out. But yeah, I definitely recommend this if you want to, you know, be introduced to British poetry. It's a really great diverse collection, lots of different voices, and I think it really gives you the opportunity to find poets who you'll enjoy. And then we have a couple of books that I absolutely loved. The first one being Frying Plantain by Zalike Reid Benta. Or I think it's Frying Plantain, but over here I would say Plantain, but I've heard the author talk and she says it's Plantain. So I'm going to say Frying Plantain. This is a collection of short stories. They can be read as short stories, but it sort of forms the narrative of a novel. So if you're new to short stories or unsure if you'd like them, I think giving something like this a go would really work. So we follow a young girl called Kiara from the age of, I think, about 10, I guess. And she lives, let me just double check where she lives. She lives in Little Jamaica in Toronto, and she's raised by her mother, who moved over from Jamaica when she was, I think, in her early 20s, and she's raised, her mother's a single mother, and so there's a lot of commentary on the fact that Kiara wasn't born in Jamaica, so there's lots of children in the community who were, and they have stronger Jamaican accents than she does, and so there's lots of push and pull with that she doesn't feel Jamaican enough either in Canada or in Jamaica when she goes to visit. Also, her grandmother lives locally, and there's a really sort of toxic relationship between her mother and her grandmother, which Kiara gets sort of pulled between a lot. There is lots of commentary on bullying. Like, I found the earlier short stories in particular like heartbreaking, and I was bullied for quite a long time at a similar age to the character was, and the tactics the bullies used were things I really recognised, and I just felt heartbreak for Kiara. So I felt all of that was told really well. As we get further in, there's a lot of commentary about the fact that her mother doesn't want her to mix with boys and wants her to just go to university and not really have much of a life outside just studying. Her mother's super focused on that, and all the themes were brilliant. I loved the writing style. I thought this was really emotional and evocative, and I could just pick this up and read it again. And the fact, even though this is a narrative in that you go from her being 10 to her being sort of university age, it does feel like a short story collection in that you could pick any story and read them out of order, and yes, reading them in order gives you extra context, but it wouldn't lessen the short story without the context. They all stand alone brilliantly. So I gave this 4.5 stars. I really loved it and I'd highly recommend it. Then we have When the Lights Go Out by Carys Bray. This is one of my most anticipated releases of 2020 because I love Carys Bray's books and I've read them all. And this eventually came out, I think, in November, although it was supposed to come out much earlier in the year. But I was glad I read this in December because this book is set in the week building up to Christmas. So you could read this nowhere near Christmas and it wouldn't matter, but I think it just added that little element to it. So this is set, I guess, in present day, but in a world where flooding is much more normal. We're following it from the wife's perspective because she's going out to do some Christmas shopping as the novel opens, and she sees her husband standing in the town with lots of signs because he is sort of picketing about climate change. But he hasn't told her he's doing this, and he starts to get more and more obsessed with what climate change is doing to the world in this week leading up to Christmas. For example, he brings rabbits home and says that he's going to start breeding them so that they can kill them when sort of the world ends and no one has any food. You know that he keeps turning the gas and electric off and telling them there's been a power cut so that they learn to adapt to living life without gas and electric. So it's a really interesting commentary on climate change, but more on this family. And how different people deal with big life-changing events. So the husband becomes obsessed with this big thing, and it becomes bigger than him, than anything else that could be happening to his family, and he thinks that's the only thing he should care about in relation to his family. Whereas the wife is upholding everything else throughout all of this, where he's just sort of off doing his worrying about climate change. She's keeping the family together, she's caring for their 2 sons, she's caring for her mother-in-law, she's making sure that even when the gas and electric isn't on, she's somehow prepared food for everybody and got everyone's presents together. And in her own way, she is very environmentally friendly. She grows her own fruit and veg, she goes beach cleaning every weekend with a group of volunteers. So it's these two ends of the spectrum of how you deal with these things. And I felt that more than anything, this was a commentary on like gender in marriages, on how all the weight is put on the woman's shoulders while the man can go off and just worry about this one thing, and everything else will be dealt with by the woman. And this was filled with everything that I love about novels. A family drama that's very slow and thoughtful. There's lots of warmth, lots of humour. The sons are really funny. The relationship with the mother-in-law is I found really hilarious. And there's also, sadness and melancholy, and it doesn't necessarily end really happily, but it ends in a way that's believable to real families and to real people. So I'm always going to love whatever Carys Bray brings out, and this is particular to me. Some people may find this book a bit too slow. I know the ratings for this aren't great, and I think that's because a lot of people expect this to be a really big climate change dystopian novel, and it's not really. It's about the family much more than it is about climate change. But yeah, I really enjoyed this one and I definitely recommend it. One that I wouldn't recommend, and I'm shocked to say this, is The Distance Between Us by Maggie O'Farrell. I've now read 4 Maggie O'Farrell novels as well as her memoir. So I read Hamnet, and I also went back to the start to read her novels in order. I really enjoyed her first novel. Let me have a look at what it is called. After You'd Gone. Her second novel, My Lover's Lover, I thought was pretty weak. And this one, The Distance Between Us, I also felt was pretty weak. I think in part this just hasn't aged well. This came out in 2004. It is about a man called Jake, who is a white British man who has been raised in Hong Kong. Something happens in Hong Kong that leads to him sort of fleeing to England, and while he's in England he decides to go to Scotland because he never met his father, but he knows the place in Scotland where his father was from, and he wants to sort of go investigate, and he's sort of running away from his life, and it's a bit of an excuse really. And then Stella, who lived in London, has also fled because as the novel opens, she's crossing London Bridge. She sees a man who reminds her of somebody, she gets absolutely terrified and she flees. So the novel is about these two meeting and what will happen, and also about their individual mysteries. Jake's mystery is much smaller, but like who's his father and what's the history of that. And Stella's mystery is much bigger, and a much bigger part of the plot being why she's scared of any man who looks like this one man, what happened with this one man. And she has a sister who she has a sort of weird relationship with, and you know that her sister's something to do with that. So what was really good about this novel, all was strong. Maggie O'Farrell tends to do this in a lot of the novels I've read. There's a big cast of characters, and she goes back in time and looks at other members of the family, so you get to see them from someone else's perspective as well as their own. I thought she dealt with the two sisters and their mother and their grandmother and their father really well. For all of that was really well written. What I didn't like was the insta love. Ridiculous. They know each other for like 2 weeks and they're already like really feeling like they love one another. It's ridiculous. And secondly, I felt like it really didn't age well in terms of Jake's personality. You're told time and time again that he gets in Stella's personal space. He also does something to upset her. She doesn't want to talk to him about it, and he will not leave her alone. At one point he picks her up and takes her into a room and locks the door and says, I'm not going to let you leave until you listen to me. And I'm like, we're supposed to find this guy like romantic and like want them to be together, and I don't. Like, get out of her personal space. Do not pick her up and lock her in a room, for God's sake. So yeah, I just don't think this aged well, and you know, you can still tell that she can really write, but this plot just wasn't for me. Then another short story collection, that being My Darling from the Lines by Rachel Long. I really enjoyed this as well. I will say that a lot of these poems are quite short, so it's one of those collections where I feel like at the time I read it I really enjoyed it, but I don't really remember much about it, so I definitely need to reread this one quite soon. I think this is a really accessible poetry collection for people who haven't read much poetry. I found that I really got on well with it, and there's also lots of commentary on childhood and like her relationship with her mother, which I really enjoyed. Like, I always enjoy that, so I enjoyed this, but I need to reread it because I read it in like one afternoon and it hasn't really stuck with me, which that isn't a negative thing, it's more me as a reader with shorter form poetry. The next one is the super popular If I Had Your Face by Frances Cha. So if you don't know, well, I'm sure you do, because this is, like I said, very popular. This follows 4 young women in contemporary Seoul in South Korea, and it's a commentary on beauty standards, particularly as pertains to being as close to whiteness as possible and how it affects the lives of these women living in South Korea. So in a way, once I started reading this, I wasn't sure how much I would enjoy it, because it's not as lyrical a writing style as I usually like, it's not as descriptive, but I just really love these women's voices and I really love the commentary, and thematically I thought this was a really strong book, and I would definitely read anything that Frances Cha brought out in the future. So you follow, like I said, these 4 women who all live in the same apartment block. 3 of them know one another very well and sort of live with one another, and one of them is a lady who lives with her husband, and she sees these girls go in and out of the apartment. And there is actually a 5th woman who's as integral to the storyline, but she doesn't get her own narrative in the story. She's more commented on by all the other women. So one of these young women is a very successful artist, one of them is a hairstylist, and one of them is a room salon girl, and one of them is an aspiring room salon girl. And then, as I said, the wife, I think, works in some sort of administrative office job. And several of these women have a past together. They grew up in the same area, and one of them, the one who works in a hair salon, is mute, you think by choice. A traumatic event happened to her when she was a teenage girl, and since then she hasn't spoken. And so the narrative of this novel you know, it could be said that you're reading and you sort of want to know what that event was and how it ties these women together. So that's sort of an element of plot and mystery, but that's not really the driving force behind the novel. It's more like, where are these women going to end up, what's happening to them, and you feel like it's more just like a slice of life, because these women's lives are going to carry on and horrible things are going to carry on happening to them because of the way society expects a certain type of beauty from them. And I just thought this was fascinating. I really loved the way these women back one another, and the way they view one another, the commentary they have, the way they view men, the way men are discussed in the novel. Capitalism is a massive part of this, and how capitalism ties in with racism and sexism I thought was really interesting. So yeah, I just thought this was great. I'd love to see this made into a mini-series. I think it could be really brilliant, and yeah, I think you should listen to everybody who's saying it's really great and pick it up as well. And the next one is another audiobook, and again I didn't enjoy it, so I feel like I was pretty unsuccessful with my audiobook listening in December. And that is She Said, Breaking the Sexual Harassment Story That Helped Ignite a Movement by Jodi Kantor and Megan Twohey. So, I thought I would love this one. This is sort of investigative journalism, predominantly about the Harvey Weinstein case. These two journalists were the women who did all the research into that, spoke to all the women who accused him, and made an article that was then published and publicly accused him, and then they followed up on all the subsequent stories that came out about Harvey Weinstein. So I thought I would love it. I gave it 2 stars. Problems with it. Firstly, you know, I think that journalists are very good, you know, not all of them, but what journalists are supposed to be good at is writing short form articles, right? So, you know, no more than like, I don't even know, 7,000 words probably. And you can tell that, like, I don't think this is well written for a whole book. The writing style is just standard, and I felt like, this is going to sound really horrible, but I felt like there was no real emotion behind this. I felt like this should have been a really evocative book that made me feel anger and sadness and hope at certain points, but it didn't really make me feel anything. It instead felt like the sort of book someone who's training as an investigative journalist would want to read. It was very dry and just fact-based about how they did the research. The research itself sounded quite boring. A lot of it was following where the money went. There's a lot of names of different people they spoke to, like accountants or lawyers of Harvey Weinstein, and it felt pretty dry, and their writing style didn't make it sing. It didn't make you feel like this was all exciting and important. And I understand that most research that goes behind cases like this is arduous and perhaps boring sounding, but it results in something that's really important. And I would have been fine with that if I just felt like there wasn't much, there was like a couple of moments, you know, well, not towards the end, that's another issue, but about 2/3 of the way through when they start to draw a close to the Harvey Weinstein situation because they published their article. There's a couple of pages where they do make they put it within context of a broader context of sexism, of sexual assault against women, and they make more commentary, and that's what I wanted more in the book. Those moments were powerful, but they were so few and far between, and in general the writing was just a bit dry, not all that great. And my other issue is that this book sells itself as a book that's focused on Harvey Weinstein, but actually about 2/3 of the way through, maybe 3/4, it moves to the Brett Kavanaugh case, and there's a really big focus on that. And I don't mind those two things being put in the same book, but they didn't really explain why. It was almost like they just also wanted to talk about that, and so they added that in. But they didn't draw the two cases together neatly. They didn't feel like they had a really great connection. It was almost like, we just want to mention this, so we're just going to spend the last 100 pages talking about this instead. And I just didn't. I actually thought that section was better written than the section that came before it, but yeah, this was disappointing to me. It reads like a book written by people who are used to writing shorter form articles, and yeah, I don't really think they managed to put it in a broader context of how important their work was, so I didn't enjoy this one. Then we have a few easier reads. So I picked up Hollowpox, The Hunt for Morrigan Crow by Jessica Townsend. This is the 3rd Nevermore book. I can't really say much. I absolutely loved this. I gave the first one 5 stars, the second one 4 stars, and this one was another 5-star read for me, and definitely my favourite of the 3 so far. This felt like a standalone. I think the second one to me felt a bit like a bridging book. This one didn't at all. I loved the fact this had loads of, they're called Wonimals, but it had loads of animal characters in it, something I adore. I also heard Lauren over at Lauren and the Books say this, and I completely agree. In the first 2 books, you feel like the adults in the story, even the ones who were supposed to love Morrigan, don't treat her all that well. They keep her in the dark about a lot of things. And in this one, that doesn't happen. People tell her things, she confides in adults. You don't get the sense of, oh God, if that child just spoke to the adults in the room, this wouldn't happen. And because everyone does talk and communicate in this novel, they just don't always agree. I also love the fact that you see lots of like magic lessons and learn more about what's happening. I want to be vague here because I don't want to spoil anything. I just loved it. It brought me so much joy, and because of that I then tried to read some more sort of joyous and easy reads to end the month off with. One of those wasn't so successful. It was The Worst Witch by Jill Murphy. I read these books as a child, and I also watched the TV series, and I don't think I realised as a child these actually came out in the 1970s, which you can definitely tell as a modern day reader. So this is super short. It's like, God, it doesn't even have, it's 100 pages, but look how big the font is. It's like really, really massive. So this is probably for like 9-year-olds, I guess. So I didn't like it because everyone's so mean. Everyone's really mean to, what is her name? Mildred Hubble. And they constantly pull her in, the teachers, and tell her she's the worst witch in the school, she's absolutely awful, she lets everyone down, her friends turn on her, and at the end when she saves the day, they're like, oh yeah, thank you Mildred, and everyone's suddenly nice to her. And it just feels like everybody's a bit mean, and this is not aged well in that regard. And so yeah, I got at the library and I was like, oh, they've got all of them, I might carry on. I'm not going to carry on. I just don't think this works for a modern day reader. And then the lovely Jen got me Princess Ever After by Katie O'Neill for Christmas. So I read this, I think the day after Boxing Day, and I loved it. I love the colour palette here. Let me see if I can find an example. It's all very like bright and bold lines, which is something I really enjoy. There's also lots of pages that sort of, you know, have a similar colour palette, which I love. And this is about 2 princesses. One is trapped within a tower, and the other one comes to save her, and then they sort of go on adventures together. This is really positive and diverse, and one of the princesses is a bit chubby and she's really picked on because of that, but that's something she's very happy with. The other princess is obviously a princess of colour, and she doesn't want to conform to the sort of norms expected of her as a princess. She wants to live the life of a prince, and I just loved it. And there's lots of cuteness and humour and warmth, so I really enjoyed it. And because of that, I treated myself to the Tea Dragon Society, also by Katie O'Neill, and I love this one even more. I've wanted this for ages, but it's super expensive in hardback and my library didn't have it, but this has just been released in paperback, so I really enjoyed it. There's less bold lines in this, which I enjoyed, and I think the colour palette in this one is also very soft, which I loved. And this one is also super positive and diverse. I love the fact that there's people, you know, and none of this is commented on. There's disabled characters, queer characters, characters of colour, and it's just part of the story. It's not something that has to be like, you know, hit over the head for readers, and a lot of the people who read this will be young people. And it doesn't sort of make that something we have to learn something from or comment on it. It just is, and I think we need more books like that. This is about little dragons who grow tea leaves out of their head. It's absolutely fucking adorable. There's already another 1 or 2 out, and I want to get them both. And I love the fact that at the back there's a little section where you like meet all the tea dragons. And so Johnny and I were like reading through and deciding which dragon goes with which of the cats. We decided that Albus is obviously the Earl Grey tea dragon. I mean, he is grey, and it says also that the Earl Grey dragon is very dignified, which Albus is. We decided that Luna is obviously the hibiscus because she's just a little bit chubby and cute. So yeah, really enjoyed this and definitely want to carry on reading all of Katie O'Neill's works. And then do I have anything else to talk about? I think I have one more book. Yes, one more book. And that is Sabrina and Corina by Fajardo-Anstine. This is a short story collection. I didn't read anywhere near enough short story collections in 2020, and I definitely want to rectify that this year. I really enjoyed this. This is a collection of short stories predominantly focused on women, and these are focused on Indigenous Latina women who live in Colorado. I think they all live in Colorado, and there's lots of commentary in this on violence against women and the roles women have in communities, and what it's like for children to grow up without like a female presence in their life, or with a mother who perhaps isn't functioning as she should because of domestic abuse or addiction. So this is fairly bleak, but so beautifully written, and I definitely read anything this author brings out in future. You know, my favourites in this sort of thing, if you give me, this is so typical of me, but if you give me a short story collection and there's a few short stories in there that are about children or teens, I'm always going to love them. I eat that up, I absolutely love it. I mean, a couple of these stories were like that. There's also some in here that are focused on the relationship between sisters or female cousins. There's one, you know, Sabrina and Corina is about 2 cousins, and one of them has died. They haven't been close for a few years, and the one who survived has been asked to prepare her cousin's body for her open casket, and she talks about the history of their relationship and how they became distant from one another. So I thought this was brilliant, beautifully written, a real, even though it's very sad, it feels like a real celebration of a community that aren't often written about. Fajardo-Anstine identifies as, and her family identify as, Indigenous and Latinx, and so they have a deep history in the US that isn't often acknowledged. So yeah, I thought this was great. I'd really recommend it, particularly if you like short story collections, and obviously it has an absolutely stunning cover. So that was really long. I finally wrapped up 2020, and I will be doing my sort of video talking about my favourite reads of the year in due course, a few days probably. Thanks so much for watching. Let me know if you've read any of these and what you thought of them, and let me know if you are planning on reading any of them. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video. Bye!